Sometimes, life throws us challenges that are hard to dodge. You might lose your job and wonder how you'll manage your bills, or perhaps you're grieving the loss of someone so vital to your life that imagining a future without them feels impossible. These are the trials that test us, shaking the very foundations of our daily lives and our future plans. In times like these, many find comfort and strength in their faith, believing that there is a higher plan and purpose for their hardships. The Bible often serves as a source of solace and inspiration, offering numerous examples where faith led to miraculous outcomes. One of the most striking examples is found in the book of Exodus. Here, the Israelites face what seems like an insurmountable obstacle, the Red Sea. Exodus 13:18 introduces us to a pivotal moment in the journey of the Israelites. It tells us when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. Instead, God chose a longer, seemingly more difficult path for them, steering them directly toward the Red Sea. This was no accident, but a part of a divine plan. Imagine being at that moment trapped between the vast sea and the approaching Egyptian army. From a human perspective, it looked like the end of the road for the Israelites. They had no means to fight back or escape, and from their standpoint, it seemed as though they were led to their doom. However, the essence of their journey and faith lay in the belief that God's plans are beyond human understanding. Then came the moment of divine intervention. Exodus 14:21 recounts, Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. This miracle not only provided them with an escape route, but also reassured them of their protected status under God's guidance. The Israelites walked through the Red Sea on dry ground, a feat that symbolized the power of faith and the miracles that it can bring forth. These stories serve to remind us that, no matter the size of the hurdle in front of us, faith can provide a path forward. The belief that if God brings you to it, He will bring you through it is a powerful affirmation of hope and resilience. Whether you're facing personal loss, professional setbacks, or any other challenge, the story of the Israelites offers a message of strength. With faith, what seems impossible might just be a part of a larger plan leading to greater freedom and fulfillment. After seeing how God moved for the Israelites and guided them safely across the Red Sea, it's easier to see that no situation is too desperate or hopeless when God is involved. The story of Jonah is yet another powerful reminder of this truth. When Jonah was called to go to Nineveh, he was so afraid that he ran in the opposite direction, but God had other plans. Jonah ended up on a boat headed for Tarshish, trying to escape God's call. But God sent a great storm so fierce that even the experienced sailors were terrified. They figured out that the storm was because of Jonah, and Jonah himself knew it too. He told them the only way to calm the sea was to throw him overboard. This might sound drastic, but Jonah knew that the storm was a direct result of his disobedience. So, reluctantly, the sailors threw him into the sea, praying that they would not be held guilty for his death. The sea calmed immediately, showing once again God's control over nature. But God wasn't done with Jonah. Instead of letting him drown, God sent a large fish to swallow him. Inside the fish's belly, Jonah spent 3 days and 3 nights. Now, from a human point of view, survival inside a fish seems impossible. One would think Jonah might be crushed or suffocated, but the Bible tells us, "But the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was inside the fish 3 days and 3 nights." Jonah 1, verse 17. Here, we see that what's impossible for us is not for God. Jonah's story didn't end in the belly of the fish. After those 3 days, Jonah prayed to God from inside the fish and was spit out onto dry land. He then went to Nineveh and delivered God's message, and the people repented. This story is not just about a man being swallowed by a fish. It's about God's patience, correction, and salvation. It's about getting a second chance to make things right, no matter how far we've run. Now, you might think that your own problems are too ordinary or too complicated compared to being swallowed by a fish. But let's look at another story from the Bible which shows God's power in everyday struggles. This one involves a widow, as told in 2 Kings. This widow was in a dire situation. Her husband had died, leaving her with debts she couldn't pay. Her creditors were coming to take her 2 sons as slaves, an all too real consequence in those times. She turned to the prophet Elisha, desperate for help. All she had left in her house was a small jar of olive oil. Elisha told her, "Go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side." 2 Kings 4, verses 3 to 4. She did as Elisha instructed, and miraculously, the oil kept flowing until she had filled all the jars she could find. This oil was then sold to pay off her debts, and she and her sons lived on what was left. God turned her small jar of oil into a bounty. These stories from Jonah and the widow demonstrate that God's ways are higher than our ways. He can use any situation, no matter how dire, to show His power and care. Whether it's calming a stormy sea, providing during financial hardship, or guiding a nation through the wilderness, God is always working in ways we might not expect, but always for our good. Jesus Himself taught about relying on God's provision in the Gospel of Matthew. He said, "So do not worry, saying, 'What shall we eat?' or 'What shall we drink?' or 'What shall we wear?' For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." Matthew 6, verses 31 to 34. This teaching is a comforting assurance that your needs are not unnoticed by God. Just as He provided for Jonah, the widow, and the Israelites, He is attentive to your needs. You might not see a miraculous multiplication of oil or a parted sea, but in ways both seen and unseen, God is working in your life. My friend, no matter what you face today, remember these stories of faith and deliverance. Let them remind you that you are not alone in your struggles. God is with you, guiding, providing, and sometimes even calming the stormy seas around you. Trust in Him, lean on His understanding, and watch how He moves mountains for you. Continuing from the stories of trust and deliverance like those of Jonah and the Israelites, we see a pattern. When God is in the picture, the impossible becomes possible. It's easy to forget this truth when you're up against tough times. You might look at your situation and wonder how you'll ever get through it. But remember, God specializes in turning tough situations around. Take Jonah's story, for example. He ran from God's call because he was afraid. He ended up in the belly of a whale, of all places. But even from inside that dark, unlikely place, God was working on Jonah's heart. And when Jonah was ready, he was spit back out, not just alive, but transformed. Ready to do what God had asked him to do. If God can work through a situation as bizarre as that, think about what he can do in your life. And then there's the widow from the second book of Kings. All she had was a small jar of oil, and yet, through Elisha's instructions and God's miraculous intervention, that small jar filled many others. She not only paid off her debts, but also secured a future for herself and her sons. From this, we learn that God doesn't just meet our needs. He often exceeds them in ways we couldn't even imagine. Jesus himself taught about the futility of worry in Matthew 6, verses 31 to 34. Why spend your energy worrying about food, drink, or clothes, the basic necessities of life? These are the things everyone worries about, but your Heavenly Father knows you need them. He takes care of the birds of the air and the flowers of the field, so won't He much more provide for you? Instead, Jesus says to focus on seeking God's kingdom and His righteousness. In other words, make your main concern God's concerns. When you align your life with God's will, everything else will fall into place. He will provide what you need when you need it. It's about trusting Him fully, even when you can't see the whole path ahead. Now, it's normal to have doubts, especially when you're staring down some of life's biggest challenges. But remember Paul's words in 2 Corinthians 12. He begged God to remove his thorn, yet God's answer was, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Paul came to boast joyfully about his weaknesses because they highlighted God's strength. This perspective shift is vital. When you embrace your weaknesses and allow God's strength to shine through them, you become a powerful testimony to His faithfulness. It's in the hard times that our faith is tested, but it's also where it grows the deepest roots. So next time you face a trial, before you start worrying about how you'll get through it, take a step back, pray, reflect on these stories. Whether it's finding strength in your weakness like Paul, trusting in God's provision like the widow, or turning back to God's path like Jonah, these are lessons that can guide you. In essence, don't just endure your challenges. Embrace them as opportunities to witness the strength and sufficiency of God. Trust that He is with you, guiding you through every hardship and providing in ways beyond what you might expect. With God, no situation is too bleak, no need too great, and no obstacle insurmountable. Remember, with Him, you are stronger than you think.